The year was 1854, and Hollow Creek lay quietly hidden in the folds of upstate New York, where the Hudson's fog stretched its fingers across valleys and clung stubbornly to pine and oak. It was the sort of town people rarely left and rarely entered. The census of the year listed fewer than 1,000 souls, nearly all of them farmers, woodcutters, or shopkeepers whose families had lived on that soil for generations. Strangers were an anomaly here, and when they appeared, every shuttered window seemed to open just a little. Every church bell seemed to ring a bit louder, as if the town itself were suspicious of intrusion. On a morning heavy with mist, the people of Hollow Creek gathered at the crossroads to watch a black carriage approach from the eastern road. The horses, tall and glossy, bore the insignia of wealth. The coachman's uniform was finer than anything the locals had ever seen. From the carriage stepped Alaric Duskbourne, a man in his mid-40s with iron-threaded hair and a face sharp as chiseled granite. His bearing was unmistakably urban. He had the gait of a financier, the stiff back of a man accustomed to counting fortunes rather than hauling wood. Beside him was his wife, Seraphine, draped in a gown of dark velvet that seemed ill-suited to the muddy lanes of Hollow Creek. She was pale, almost spectral, with features delicate enough to suggest nobility but eyes that carried a sorrowful, predatory weight. They had come, they told the townsfolk, to escape the noise and grime of New York City. Alaric had made his wealth in trade, though few ever learned what sort of trade it was. Seraphine claimed she wanted only silence, gardens, and a place where her fragile health might be restored. Their new home was an abandoned manor that locals whispered about in hushed tones Ashwood House, a sprawling Gothic structure of stone and timber, perched on a hill like a watchtower over the town. The house had been uninhabited for years. Its previous owner, a reclusive judge, had died alone in one of its shadowed rooms, and since then no family dared to enter it. Children told stories of voices in its corridors, of flickering candlelight in its windows when the place was supposedly empty. Farmers avoided the road that wound past its gates after dusk, muttering that the house had a hunger of its own. Yet the Duskbournes took possession of Ashwood House with startling swiftness. Alaric paid laborers to scrape away the rot, to replace warped beams, to rehang heavy curtains of imported fabric. By midsummer, the place no longer looked like a ruin. Its gardens bloomed with roses from England, its iron gates gleamed with fresh black paint, and from its chimneys rose columns of smoke each night, as if the house itself had inhaled and come alive again. For the townspeople, the transformation was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Many admired the couple's refinement. Alaric tipped his hat with grace, and Seraphine spoke with a voice so soft it seemed always on the edge of breaking. She was often seen lingering at the churchyard fence on Sundays, not inside with the congregation but at its margins, watching the children as they spilled out after service. Mothers noticed her gaze long, lingering, almost hungry. She looked, one woman later said, like a mother who had buried all her children, though we knew she had never had any. In Hollow Creek, family was everything. To remain childless was not merely unfortunate, it was a tragedy whispered about at market stalls and over the pews. People pitied Seraphine, though her sorrow carried an edge that made some uncomfortable. On warm evenings, neighbors reported seeing her sit motionless on the balcony of Ashwood House, eyes fixed on the fields where boys played at wrestling and girls chased each other with ribbons. She would watch until the light failed, her white hands clasped so tightly on the railing that they seemed almost bloodless. By late autumn, whispers began to stir. The Duskbournes had been generous to the church, donating funds for a new roof, and Alaric had spoken of investing in the local schoolhouse. But generosity did not erase strangeness. Why did they never attend gatherings? Why did Seraphine walk the lanes alone at night, trailing her fingers against every wooden gate as if counting them? Why did Ashwood House, despite its lavish restoration, still seem to radiate coldness, its windows like unblinking eyes? The answer came the following year. In the spring of 1855, the couple appeared at Sunday service with a child, a boy, no more than 2 years old, with solemn dark eyes and hair that curled in uneven wisps. His name, they said, was Thaddeus. The townsfolk were astonished. Where had he come from? The Duskbournes explained little. They had taken him in. Seraphine whispered, her voice tinged with relief and pride. She clutched him so tightly that the boy squirmed, his small hands grasping the folds of her dress as though bound to her. The community reacted with joy. An orphan rescued. A childless woman blessed what could be more righteous. The parish organized a blessing ceremony. Gifts of food and toys were delivered to Ashwood House. For a brief moment, it seemed the Duskbournes had woven themselves into the fabric of Hollow Creek. But unease returned during the ceremony itself, when Reverend Obadiah Crane extended his arms to hold Thaddeus and bless him. Seraphine froze. Her expression twisted into something feral, protective beyond reason. Only after Alaric leaned close, whispering into her ear, did she reluctantly release the child. Even then, she stood so near the Reverend that her breath brushed against his collar. The congregation excused it as maternal devotion, but some whispered afterward that her possessiveness was unnatural, as though she feared the child might vanish if touched by another. There was another detail that troubled the curious. No one had seen papers of adoption. No birth certificate, no baptismal record. When asked, Alaric's response was vague. The boy came from Boston, from an orphanage now destroyed by fire. The records, he said, were lost. His tone was firm, discouraging further questions. Most accepted it. After all, who would dare accuse the Duskbournes of deceit? They were wealthy, polished, untouchable. And yet the questions lingered. Why did Thaddeus never mingle with the other children? Why did he stare at the ground, silent, while Seraphine's hand pressed down firmly on his shoulder? Why? When he did smile, did it seem more like an imitation than a true burst of joy? In hindsight, this was the first crack in the mask, the first shiver of unease that crept through Hollow Creek. What seemed at first like charity, the salvation of an orphan, would, in time, prove to be the opening act of a much darker play. The Duskbournes' hunger for children had only just begun, and Hollow Creek would learn, too late, that some families are not built from love but from obsession, and that beneath the grandeur of Ashwood House, something unspeakable was already stirring. The arrival of little Thaddeus in 1855 did not soothe Seraphine Duskbourne's restless yearning, it sharpened it. What should have been fulfillment only became the first sip of water for a thirst that would never be quenched. Hollow Creek's women remarked that Seraphine seemed transformed after the child entered her life. No longer content merely to watch from the balcony of Ashwood House, she now paraded Thaddeus through the lanes, clinging to him like a saint might cling to a relic. Her eyes, once pools of sorrow, now glimmered with something more dangerous possession. From the beginning, her behavior unsettled the neighbors. Seraphine refused to allow Thaddeus to play with other children. When curious mothers suggested play dates, she would smile politely, then invent excuses. He was too ill, he had too much schooling, he needed quiet. The boy was rarely seen outside the iron gates of Ashwood House, and when he was, his eyes carried the blankness of a child who had learned that joy was a forbidden indulgence. Alaric, meanwhile, seemed to encourage his wife's fixation. "A devoted mother," he would say when neighbors raised an eyebrow. Is there anything purer? He was quick to remind people that he and Seraphine had been denied biological children, that this new life was nothing less than providence. His voice was smooth, his words persuasive, and his wealth made it dangerous for others to press further. Still, the whispers began. It was only 2 years later, in the summer of 1857, that the whispers grew into genuine alarm. One morning, the Duskbournes appeared at church not with one child, but two. Thaddeus now had a sister, a solemn little girl called Irisbeth. She was pale, her hair a tangle of dark curls, and she clung to Seraphine's skirts as though the world beyond was something poisonous. When asked where she had come from, Alaric once again provided a vague answer from a distant orphanage that no longer existed. The records destroyed. The excuse sounded eerily familiar. By 1859, there were 4 children in the household: Thaddeus, Irisbeth, a thin boy named Corvin, and a younger girl, Salora. None bore a family resemblance, yet all shared the same hollow-eyed obedience. They sat in perfect rows during Sunday service, never squirming, never whispering, never daring to glance at one another. Parishioners said they looked less like siblings than like students drilled in a school of silence. The speed of these adoptions was unprecedented. Even in that era, with its looser structures of guardianship, it was unusual for a single family to acquire so many children so quickly. Reverend Obadiah Crane, who had once pitied Seraphine's childlessness, now confessed unease. "The Lord blesses families," he told his congregation, "but he does not bless deception, and I fear something is hidden behind those gates." His words, however, were careful. The Duskbournes were wealthy benefactors to the church, and Hollow Creek was a place where survival often depended on generosity from one's neighbors. Few dared to antagonize Alaric directly. Accounts from those who glimpsed the children painted an unsettling picture. A seamstress recalled taking measurements for Irisbeth's Sunday dress and noticing her flinch at every touch, her gaze darting toward Seraphine before she answered even the simplest question. Another neighbor, a farmer, described how Thaddeus once wandered near his field, only to be summoned back by a single sharp clap from Alaric. The boy froze, then ran back at once, his posture rigid with fear. Behind the shutters of Ashwood House, matters were far darker. Decades later, testimony from a former servant, Anastasia Corvin, revealed the peculiar routines of the Duskbourne household. She described how Seraphine kept meticulous control over every moment of the children's lives when they ate, when they prayed, when they were allowed to speak. The punishments were subtle but cruel denials of food, forced hours of silence, endless kneeling on the wooden floor until blood pooled beneath their knees. To outsiders, the children looked healthy, but within the mansion, they lived as prisoners of ritual. The townsfolk might have ignored these oddities indefinitely, dismissing them as the eccentricities of a wealthy family, had it not been for Seraphine's growing hunger. After 4 children, she wanted more. By 1862, additional boys appeared Malric and Oswin, their origins as murky as the rest. Hollow Creek's population was small, and soon the Duskbournes' brood numbered nearly 1/10 of the town's children. Yet none were ever enrolled in the modest schoolhouse. Seraphine claimed she was teaching them herself, drawing on sacred texts and higher methods she said no common instructor could provide. By then, Hollow Creek was divided. Some continued to view the Duskbournes as saviors, rescuers of the abandoned. Others began to mutter of darker explanations. Child selling, perhaps, or ritual. 12 children without papers, one farmer whispered, is not charity, it is commerce or worse. The tension reached its first breaking point in 1861 when tragedy struck. Young Corvin, then about 7, fell from a tree in the Ashwood orchard and broke his arm. Most mothers would have rushed a child to the local physician. Seraphine did not. Drawing upon her brief training as a midwife's assistant, she attempted to set the bone herself, binding it with strips of cloth soaked in vinegar and herbs. Infection soon set in, when at last Alaric relented and summoned Dr. Callista Morwin. The boy was already fevered and delirious. The physician demanded the child's medical history, his vaccination record, his birth papers. Alaric's response was cold. All had perished in a fire. Dr. Morwen pressed further, and his composure cracked. Witnesses recalled how he threatened to remove the boy to another town if the doctor dared pry into their affairs again. Doctor. Morwen, suspicious but powerless, filed a quiet report with county authorities. Nothing came of it. The Duskbournes' reputation and their coin were enough to silence questions. Corvin survived, but with a twisted arm he would carry for life. And Hollow Creek, which might have taken warning from the episode, instead chose the path of least resistance. The town turned its eyes away. By 1862, the Duskbourne household held 7 children, each as silent and obedient as the last. They appeared at church in rows, their eyes fixed forward, their mouths closed. And yet, every so often, someone in the congregation would catch the faintest flicker in one of their faces, the haunted look of children who had learned that even their thoughts were no longer their own. It was then, some later said, that Hollow Creek should have acted. But fear, wealth, and the polished veneer of respectability protected the Duskbournes. The people of the town chose comfort over confrontation, and in that silence, Seraphine's obsession was allowed to deepen. What had begun as longing had transformed into hunger, and hunger would soon become something far darker, a doctrine, a creed, a ritual. The seeds of horror had been planted. Now they were beginning to grow. By the mid-1860s, the Duskbourne estate had become a place of fascination and dread in equal measure. What began as whispers of charity had hardened into uneasy silence. 7 children already lived within the walls of Ashwood House, and yet, by 1864, the number had swelled again. The new arrivals, Ephrael, Lucilla, and Bastian, were added with such speed that even the most trusting neighbors could no longer ignore the oddity. Families in Hollow Creek began to ask themselves questions they dared not voice aloud. From where did these children come? Why were there no records, no guardians, no letters of inquiry? The Civil War raged across the nation, producing countless orphans. But still, adoption was neither simple nor swift. For the Duskbournes, to acquire 10 children in less than a decade was a feat bordering on the impossible. Still, Alaric's money had a way of smoothing suspicion. He donated heavily to the church's rebuilding fund when a storm collapsed part of the chapel roof. He purchased new plows for the farmers whose sons had gone to war. He even funded a public well in the town square. Each act of generosity bought him another season of silence. People learned to accept the presence of the children as one accepts the sound of the river ever present, unexamined, unsettling only if one thought too long upon it. But others could not ignore the signs. Reverend Obadiah Crane observed that the children never joined in communal games after service. They sat in a straight line on the grass, hands folded, eyes fixed on Seraphine's every movement. If another child dared approach them, the Duskbourne children would stiffen. Their smiles rehearsed, their answers clipped. It was as though they were waiting for a signal, or fearing punishment. One Sunday, a farmer's boy named Jonas attempted to play tag with young Bastian. The Duskbourne child allowed himself to be touched, then froze as though struck by lightning. His lips trembled, his eyes darted toward Seraphine, who sat nearby with her lace-gloved hands folded. A single narrowing of her gaze was all it took. Bastian turned away, walked back to the row of siblings, and sat in silence. Jonas later told his mother he had never felt so cold in his life, as if that boy had no soul of his own. Inside Ashwood House, life was cloaked in secrecy. Anastasia Corvin, who served as a maid during those years, later confessed to hearing strange sounds at night. Chanting, rhythmic footsteps, children weeping. She recalled trays of food left outside locked doors on the upper floor doors she was forbidden to open. If she asked questions, Seraphine would fix her with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through bone. Some children require separation, she would murmur. Anastasia soon learned not to ask again. By 1865, the Duskbournes' brood numbered 10 children. The household rarely interacted with the town anymore, save for appearances at church and the occasional delivery of goods. Even then, Alaric always paid in coin rather than barter, discouraging the normal social exchanges that knit Hollow Creek together. Their mansion, once a curiosity, had become a fortress of silence. Neighbors, however, began to share disturbing tales. A milkmaid delivering cream claimed she saw a girl at one of the high windows, Lucilla, perhaps, or someone else, entirely staring out with eyes red from crying. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Another villager swore he saw Seraphine walking the grounds by moonlight, whispering into the dark while the children stood in a ring behind her, motionless. The growing unease was sharpened by a peculiar detail. All the townsfolk eventually noticed none of the Duskbourne children attended the local school. At first, Seraphine claimed she educated them herself. But as the years passed, no one ever saw them with books or slates. Instead, they recited verses under their breath in strange cadences, not quite scripture, not quite song. The words, if overheard, carried an unfamiliar rhythm, as though borrowed from some ancient tongue. One teacher, visiting the estate to petition Alaric for funds, overheard these murmurings through the parlor door. She later described them as prayers twisted into knots. When she mentioned it to the Reverend, he only shook his head. "I have asked Alaric directly," Reverend Crane confessed. "He tells me it is Seraphine's method, a way of instilling obedience. But I fear there is doctrine here I do not recognize." The Reverend was not alone in his concern. Dr. Callista Morwin, still unsettled by her earlier encounter with the Duskbournes, noticed something strange when she examined town records. The dates when the Duskbournes adopted their children often aligned with reports of missing youngsters from surrounding counties. A boy vanished from Albany in 1862, a girl from Kingston in 1863. In each case, the timing coincided uncannily with the appearance of a new Duskbourne child, yet no one dared to accuse them. Alaric's connections stretched into Albany and New York City, and Hollow Creek was a small place. Who among them would challenge a man whose wealth could crush them with lawsuits or silence them with bribes meanwhile? The children themselves seemed less like siblings than shadows. Villagers who passed by the estate spoke of glimpsing them in the gardens, walking in slow, synchronized patterns as if rehearsing some silent drill. They looked like little soldiers of an invisible army, one farmer's wife recalled. Their eyes never lifted from the ground. By 1866, even the most skeptical could no longer deny that something was amiss. That winter, the Duskbournes introduced yet another child, Orrin, a small boy with ash-colored hair. He appeared one Sunday, seated at the end of the row. No announcement, no explanation. When questioned, Alaric merely smiled. "The Lord provides," he said, and that was the end of it. Hollow Creek's silence grew heavier. The townsfolk were caught between reverence for wealth and fear of what lay hidden in Ashwood House. Some convinced themselves it was none of their concern. Others prayed quietly for the children's safety. But all agreed on one thing: the Duskbournes were no ordinary family. In the years to come, their mansion would no longer be known as Ashwood House. The townsfolk gave it a new name, the House of 12, for the number of children rumored to live there. Whether the number was exact or not hardly mattered. The name stuck, whispered at wells, muttered over hearths, etched into the town's uneasy memory. And beneath that name lurked a question that gnawed at Hollow Creek like rot at the roots of an old tree: were these children truly saved or sacrificed? The year 1867 brought a bitter winter to Hollow Creek. The river froze so thick that children skated upon its surface, and snow piled high against the windows of farmhouses until doors could hardly open. It was in this season of ice and silence that tragedy struck within the walls of Ashwood House. The child was Orrin, the pale-haired boy who had appeared so suddenly only the year before. By all accounts he had been frail, his frame thin as a reed, his eyes dulled by some lingering sickness or sorrow. One January afternoon, he attempted to climb one of the great oaks that marked the edge of the Duskbourne orchard. A branch snapped beneath his weight, and he fell, his arm shattering in the snow with a crack so loud a passing farmhand swore he heard it from the road. Most mothers would have panicked, rushing to summon the doctor. But Seraphine Duskbourne was not most mothers. Drawing upon what she claimed were remedies of the old country, she carried Orrin inside, laid him upon a table in the shuttered parlor, and began to set the bone herself. Witnesses later described the strange smells that seeped from the house that night: vinegar, burning herbs, and something metallic, like iron left in the rain. Instead of splints, Seraphine bound the arm with strips of linen soaked in a blackish tincture. She muttered prayers as she worked, words unfamiliar to any known liturgy, drawing circles with chalk on the wooden floor. To Orrin's agony, she seemed oblivious, her hands steady, her eyes alight with fervor. Within days, the boy's arm blackened, the wound swelling with infection. His fever grew so fierce that the household staff whispered he raved in his sleep of shadows crawling across the walls. At last, Alaric relented. Though furious at his wife's methods, he dared not watch the boy waste away. Under the cover of night, he sent a carriage to summon Dr. Callista Morwen, the town's only physician. She arrived wrapped in a heavy cloak, carrying her leather satchel of instruments and remedies. What she found horrified her. Orrin was already in the throes of septic fever, she later recalled in testimony. His skin was gray, his lips cracked, his eyes sunken, and yet not once did he cry out, even as I lanced the wound to drain the infection. He lay perfectly still, as if he feared more the wrath of the woman who called herself his mother than the pain of the knife. Doctor. Morwen asked at once for the boy's records, vaccinations, previous ailments, proof of birth. Alaric's response was swift and cold. The papers, he claimed, had been destroyed in a fire at an orphanage in Providence. It was the same excuse he and Seraphine had given before, rehearsed to the point of perfection. When Dr. Morwen pressed further, suggesting the county registrar could be consulted, Alaric's composure cracked. He slammed his fist upon the mantel and declared that if she valued her position in Hollow Creek, she would drop the matter. Yet Dr. Morwen could not forget the hollow stare of Orrin's eyes, or the way the other children lingered at the edge of the room, silent as statues, watching her with the stillness of prisoners. She suspected more than negligence, something ritualistic, something deliberate. Against her better judgment, she filed a confidential report with the county's child welfare clerk in Albany. The investigation fell to a young caseworker who traveled to Hollow Creek 3 weeks later. His name, the records show, was Edwin Talbot, an earnest man with little experience but a zeal for rules. He interviewed the Duskbournes, toured the estate, and spoke briefly with several of the children. His report, preserved in the county archive, was chilling in its naivety. The home environment is orderly, clean, and well-provisioned, Talbot wrote. The children appear healthy, if somewhat reserved. Mrs. Duskbourne explained her attempt to treat Orrin's injury as the act of a mother with some training in folk remedies, motivated by fear of hospitals rather than disregard for the boy's welfare. While ill-advised, her actions do not constitute deliberate neglect. I recommend no further action. With those words, the case was closed. The file gathered dust in Albany, while in Hollow Creek life returned, outwardly, to normal. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks in the facade widened. For Orrin, survival came at a cost. The infection left his arm twisted and weak, and he carried the mark of Seraphine's failed healing for the rest of his short life. More haunting still was his silence. Neighbors noted that even after his recovery, the boy never spoke above a whisper. He obeyed instantly when summoned, never laughed, never cried. As one villager put it, it was as if the fever burned away whatever spark of childhood he once had. For Dr. Morwen, the memory lingered like a thorn. She confided to Reverend Crane that she believed something monstrous hid within Ashwood House, but the Reverend, though sympathetic, was cautious. The Duskbournes' donations had rebuilt half the church roof. To accuse them without proof would risk ruin. He urged patience, prayer, and discretion. Thus, the town remained complicit in its silence. The Duskbournes, outwardly untouchable, continued their peculiar life. The number of children swelled again. By the end of 1868, there were 11 within those walls. And still none bore certificates, none attended school, none played freely in the streets, but the winter of Orrin's fall had left its mark. For the first time, Hollow Creek had glimpsed behind the polished veneer of the Duskbourne family and seen something raw, something cruel. And though officialdom dismissed it as an accident, the townsfolk carried a new unease in their hearts. "They are not raising those children as sons and daughters," one farmer's wife muttered to her neighbor. "They are keeping them." It would be years before the truth emerged. Years before the authorities finally stormed Ashwood House. But in hindsight, many would point to Orrin's broken arm as the moment the mask first slipped, the first undeniable sign that within those walls, motherhood was not love but possession, and medicine was not healing but ritual. The town had been given its warning, and it had chosen not to listen. By the spring of 1869, Hollow Creek welcomed new neighbors, though the word welcome was used more cautiously now than in years past. The town had learned, perhaps unconsciously, to be wary of the strangers. And yet, the arrival of Silas Vane, his wife Morwenna, and their teenage daughter Isolde stirred both curiosity and relief. Silas Vane was a journalist by trade. Having worked for a modest paper in Albany, his wife, Morwenna, came from Cornish stock and was known for her charitable work with orphan asylums and workhouses. Their daughter, Isolde, pale and sharp-eyed, had inherited her mother's intuition and her father's appetite for truth. The family had chosen Hollow Creek for its quietude, or so they said, but soon enough it became clear that fate had placed them there for a darker reason. Their modest house sat not far from the looming estate of the Duskbournes, close enough that the two families became neighbors, though not companions. From the first week, Morwenna noticed peculiarities. While walking Isolde home from church, she observed the Duskbourne children filing in a perfect row behind Seraphine, heads bowed, not speaking or glancing at one another. It was as though they were tethered by invisible strings. She later wrote in her notes, "Children do not move like that unless trained, or broken." Silas, too, sensed unease. His work as a journalist had taught him to recognize patterns, and what he saw unsettled him. He remembered reports from other towns of missing children, names that had never been printed again, families that faded from record as though swallowed by the earth. And here, in Hollow Creek, a single household had amassed nearly a dozen children without ever producing a birth certificate, adoption decree, or baptismal entry. The first true alarm came one evening when Isolde returned from the well, pale and trembling. She had seen one of the Duskbourne boys, Thaddeus, the eldest, kneeling in the frost outside the estate's gates, his hands folded behind his back, his face turned toward the ground. He remained motionless, even as the cold bit into his skin. When Seraphine emerged from the house, lantern in hand, the boy lifted his head only slightly. She whispered something Isolde could not hear, and Thaddeus rose, following her inside with the obedience of a dog. It was not discipline, Isolde told her parents. It was worship. Morwenna's suspicions deepened. With her experience in charitable institutions, she had met many traumatized children, and she recognized the same signs in the Duskbourne brood, flinching at sudden movements, silence in the presence of adults, and an almost desperate vigilance in their eyes, as if forever waiting for permission to breathe. She began keeping notes, dates, observations, fragments of overheard speech. It was a habit that would later prove both invaluable and dangerous. Despite her misgivings, Morwenna attempted to befriend Seraphine. She hoped, perhaps, that closeness might offer insight. At first, Seraphine received her politely. They met for tea on several occasions, seated in the Ashwood parlor where the heavy curtains blocked out the daylight. The conversations were odd, weighted with pauses. Seraphine rarely spoke of the children except to praise their obedience. "They are pure," she said once, her pale lips curling into a faint smile. "I've cleansed them of what they once were." Morwenna pressed gently. What did she mean? From what had they been cleansed? Seraphine only stared at her guest with unblinking eyes and replied, "This world births children in sin. I am their vessel of redemption." It was during one of these visits that Morwenna first noticed the locked door on the upper landing. She heard faint sounds from beyond it shuffling, the muffled cry of a child. When she inquired, Seraphine waved the matter aside. "Storage," she said coolly. "An old house makes many noises," but the explanation rang hollow. The Vanes began to compare observations. Silas, drawing upon his work in Albany, researched adoption practices across New York. He discovered that several orphan asylums had been shuttered in the 1850s and 60s for corruption and illicit placements. Records were missing, falsified, or burned in fires of suspicious origin. The dates of these closures overlapped with the years in which the Duskbournes' family had grown most rapidly. Morwenna, meanwhile, noticed a disturbing pattern in the children's church attendance. During sermons about sin and salvation, the Duskbourne children would murmur phrases under their breath, phrases that bore no resemblance to Scripture. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost chant-like. Once, when Reverend Crane preached on the wages of sin, the children raised their heads in unison and whispered, "The vessel takes it." The congregation pretended not to hear. Isolde, though only 16, was bold enough to observe the family more directly. On a moonlit night, she climbed the hill overlooking Ashwood House. From the trees, she saw a circle of children in the garden, their hands joined, their bodies swaying. At the center stood Seraphine, her arms raised, her face lit by a lantern's glow. She was chanting in a language Isolde did not recognize, though certain words sounded like fragments of Latin twisted into strange forms. The children moved as though entranced, their eyes vacant. Isolde fled in terror, but the image never left her. When she confided in her parents, Silas grew grim. "If we remain silent," he told Morwenna, "we become accomplices." Yet they knew too well the dangers. The Duskbournes were powerful in Hollow Creek, their wealth and influence woven into the very fabric of the town. To accuse them without proof would risk not only scorn, but ruin. And so the Vanes proceeded cautiously, gathering evidence in secret. Morwenna's notes grew thicker. Silas clipped articles about missing children, and Isolde began sketching what she had seen drawings of the children's hollow faces, the locked door, the strange symbols faintly etched into the garden soil. The people of Hollow Creek, however, continued to look away. Some said the Vanes were simply jealous of the Duskbournes' wealth. Others whispered that Morwenna was too imaginative, that her background among orphans had filled her head with suspicions. And still others avoided the topic altogether, preferring ignorance to confrontation. But truth has a way of festering, even in silence. The Vanes had seen enough to know that something unspeakable lay hidden within Ashwood House. And as 1870 approached, their quiet investigation would place them in grave danger because in Hollow Creek, curiosity was a sin the Duskbournes never forgave. By the summer of 1870, the strange routines of the Duskbourne family had become impossible for the Vanes to ignore. Morwenna's notebook was filled with observations, the children's unnatural silence, the way they recoiled at sudden sounds, the locked door she had glimpsed on the upper floor of Ashwood House. Yet what troubled her most were the noises. On more than one visit, as she sat with Seraphine in the dim parlor, sipping bitter tea, she heard faint sounds drifting from above the muffled shuffle of feet, the creak of floorboards, once even a stifled sob. When she asked about it, Seraphine's answer was delivered with that same cold serenity the house is old. Morwenna. It speaks in its own tongue. But Morwenna had worked in orphanages. She knew the timbre of a child's cry. Her suspicion turned to certainty one rainy afternoon. Invited to tea, she excused herself to fetch a handkerchief and wandered toward the staircase. There, on the landing, she paused. From behind the locked door at the far end of the hall came a thin, keening wail. It was unmistakably human, heartbreakingly small. Morwenna's breath caught. She approached, her hand trembling on the knob. But before she could test it, Seraphine's voice called sharply from below, "The house is not for wandering." Morwenna froze, retreating, her heart pounding. That night, she wrote, "There are children in that room, children not seen in the pews, nor counted among the family. Hidden children." The matter might have ended there, left as another dreadful suspicion, had it not been for what happened weeks later. While returning from the market, Morwenna passed beneath the looming gables of Ashwood House. Glancing upward, she saw a face at the third-floor window. It was a girl, no more than 10, with tangled dark hair and hollow eyes that stared down with silent desperation. Morwenna stopped in her tracks, clutching her basket. The child blinked, parted her lips as though to speak, then vanished, pulled away by unseen hands. When Morwenna confronted Seraphine days later, the woman only laughed, her voice brittle. "You must be mistaken." Perhaps it was Lucilla or Salora playing at the glass. Children are fond of staring. But Morwenna had met all of the named children, and the face she had seen belonged to none of them. Word of the sighting spread quickly. Hollow Creek was a town of gossip, and soon whispers circulated about the girl in the window. Farmers spoke of hearing cries carried on the wind from Ashwood House. A milkman claimed he saw candlelight flickering in the attic when the rest of the mansion lay dark. The townsfolk began to murmur of the Duskbourne shadows and the hidden ones. Reverend Crane, pressed by uneasy parishioners, attempted to intervene. He visited Alaric and Seraphine, gently raising the rumors. Alaric's response was curt. "Children imagine much," he said, his tone slicing like a blade. "Our family is whole. No more need be said." The Reverend left unsettled, silenced by the weight of the Duskbournes' wealth and influence. Meanwhile, Isolde Vine grew more daring. One evening she lingered near the estate's grounds, sketchbook in hand. From the cover of a hedge she watched as the Duskbourne children were herded indoors at dusk. All filed through the great door except one. A thin figure lingered at the margin of the garden, glancing fearfully toward the windows. Isolde swore the child was unfamiliar smaller, dirtier, her dress ragged compared to the others' finely tailored garments. She stood only a moment before Seraphine appeared, seized her roughly by the arm, and dragged her inside. When Isolde told her mother, Morwenna's face paled. She recorded the account in her growing dossier, noting, "At least one child exists who is not recognized, not presented at church, not acknowledged." Where did she come from, and why is she hidden? The townsfolk, too, began to take notice of the peculiar arithmetic. The Duskbournes claimed 11 children. Yet some swore they had seen more shapes flitting behind curtains, faces at windows, shadows that multiplied when counted. One farmer's wife declared, "They have too many by one, maybe two. The numbers shift like water. It is not natural." Fear fed speculation. Some whispered the Duskbournes kept changeling children, stolen by fairies or devils. Others suggested darker crimes that the couple trafficked orphans, or that Seraphine experimented with occult cures. A few muttered that she sought to create a perfect brood, and any child who failed was hidden away until discarded. Through it all, Alaric maintained his veneer of civility. He donated generously to the town's harvest fund, attended select council meetings, and dressed immaculately. But the more he smiled, the less the townsfolk trusted him. His wealth had become a shield, and everyone knew it. The Vanes, however, could not remain silent. Silas began compiling news clippings of missing children from across New York and Pennsylvania. The dates aligned with the years when new faces appeared in Hollow Creek. Morwenna gathered testimonies quietly: the milkman, the seamstress, the farmer's wife. Each story added weight to the suspicion that Ashwood House was not merely a home, but a prison. And yet, nothing was done. The sheriff shrugged when pressed. The county clerk filed complaints into drawers. To challenge the Duskbournes was to court ruin. And so Hollow Creek persisted in its silence, choosing ignorance over confrontation. But beneath that silence, dread grew. Children began to avoid the hill where Ashwood House loomed. Parents warned their sons and daughters never to wander near its gates, and at night when the wind moaned through the trees. Villagers swore they heard not the groan of timbers but the cries of children, thin, hollow, and unending. It was then the townsfolk gave the hidden ones a name: the children of the attic. The phrase passed in whispers, never spoken in daylight, but it clung to Hollow Creek like smoke. Everyone knew the Duskbournes had secrets locked behind those high windows. The question was not whether, but how terrible. By the autumn of 1870, Silas Vane had grown convinced that the peculiarities of the Duskbourne family were not isolated oddities, but part of a larger, darker pattern, while Morwenna filled her notebooks with first-hand observations. Silas took another approach: research. With his background in journalism, he knew the power of records the way names, dates, and absences could speak louder than whispers. He began his work in Albany, traveling once a month under the pretense of submitting articles to old colleagues. Instead, he spent his hours in the county archive, scouring fragile ledgers and fading broadsheets. What he found was chilling. Between 1855 and 1870, reports of missing children dotted the state like bloodstains. A boy named Elias vanished from Kingston in 1857. A girl, Miriam, disappeared from a Troy workhouse in 1859. In 1861, brothers Jonas and Abram were lost from a foster farm near Syracuse. None of these cases had been solved. Most had scarcely been investigated. But Silas noticed something remarkable. Each disappearance coincided almost exactly with the year a new child appeared at Ashwood House. He compiled a chart, the ink trembling under his pen as the parallels became undeniable. Thaddeus, 1855. Elias missing. Irisbeth, 1857. Miriam missing. Corvin, 1859. The Syracuse brothers gone. On and on it went, the two columns mirroring each other with dreadful symmetry. By the time Silas finished, his hands were cold with sweat. Back in Hollow Creek, he shared his findings with Morwenna and Isolde. His wife grew pale as she read, her lips tightening. "It is worse than I feared," she whispered. "They are not adopting. They are harvesting." Isolde, ever braver than her years, pressed her father. "Then we must tell the Reverend." or the sheriff. But Silas shook his head. He knew the Sheriff Marshal Ephraim Blackthorne was indebted to Alaric Duskbourne, who had funded repairs to the jailhouse. And Reverend Crane, though troubled, had already been warned into silence. To present accusations without irrefutable proof would be to sign their own ruin. So Silas continued his investigation quietly. He corresponded with a colleague in Pennsylvania, who confirmed that several orphan asylums there had been shuttered after scandals involving undocumented placements. The years matched again. Every closure corresponded with the rapid expansion of the Duskbourne household. Even more disturbing, some of the shuttered institutions reported fires that destroyed their archives, fires suspiciously similar to the lost record story Alaric repeated whenever challenged. Meanwhile, Morwenna persisted in her cautious visits to Ashwood House. She began to notice inconsistencies in Seraphine's stories. At times, Seraphine claimed a child had come from Boston, at others from Providence, and sometimes she refused to name any place at all. Children are not born from cities, Morwenna noted grimly in her journal. They are born from mothers. But Seraphine never speaks of mothers, only of sins. Isolde, too, played her part. She befriended one of the younger Duskbourne girls, Selora, during a rare church picnic. While their mothers conversed, the girls exchanged whispered words. Isolde asked what game Selora liked to play. The child stared at her blankly, as though the concept of play were foreign. Then, in a voice low and mechanical, she said, "We do not play, we prepare." Before Isolde could ask what that meant, Seraphine's shadow fell across them, and Selora shrank into silence. That phrase haunted Isolde, and she sketched it into her notebook beside drawings of the locked attic door. We do not play. We prepare. Prepare for what? As the weeks passed, Silas became certain he was circling a truth too monstrous for the town to face. Yet, the more he uncovered, the more he understood why the Duskbournes had never been questioned. They had built a fortress not only of stone, but of influence. Alaric's donations bought loyalty. His connections in Albany shielded him from scrutiny. Even when rumors spread of the girl in the attic, nothing touched them. But Silas also sensed something beyond mere corruption, something spiritual, perhaps even ritualistic. Margaret's notebook, Morwenna once observed, contained phrases twisted from Scripture. The children murmured chants at church that no one else recognized. And Seraphine's eyes, when she spoke of cleansing, burned with the fervor of a prophetess. Silas wondered, were the Duskbournes not merely abducting children, but attempting to reshape them into instruments of some private faith? Was Ashwood House not a home, but a cloister for a cult of two, with their unwilling offspring as congregants in late October? Silas confided his findings to Inspector Lucian Harrow, a junior officer he trusted from Albany. Harrow was cautious but intrigued. He warned Silas that without physical evidence, the courts would dismiss everything as conjecture. But he promised to watch for further reports of missing children in surrounding counties. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek itself seemed to sink deeper into dread. Farmers avoided the estate road at night. Mothers pulled their children closer when the Duskbournes passed in town. Yet none spoke openly, for fear of reprisal. We live beneath their roof, though we never step inside it, one villager said. They are the town's shadow, and shadows cannot be banished by whispers. For the Vanes, the burden grew heavy. Every night they gathered at their kitchen table, spreading out Silas's clippings, Morwenna's notes, Isolde's sketches. The evidence pointed in one direction. Ashwood House was not merely a place of eccentricity, but of captivity. Children were being taken, erased, and remade, and somewhere in its locked attic rooms, the truth waited to be uncovered. Morwenna summed it in her diary, "This is no family. It is a system, a ritual. And unless we act, Hollow Creek will be remembered not for its fields and rivers, but for the silence in which children disappeared." The Vanes had gathered enough to suspect the scope of the horror. What they lacked was proof. proof that would soon come, though at a cost none of them could have imagined. By the winter of 1871, Inspector Lucian Harrow had grown restless. The fragmentary evidence gathered by Silas Vane was compelling but insufficient. Names, dates, and whispers could stir suspicion but not secure warrants. Harrow needed testimony, someone who had seen the inner life of Ashwood House, someone who could describe not just rumors but practices. It was Morwenna who provided the lead. Among the townsfolk she had quietly questioned. One name recurred in half-hushed tones: Anastasia Corvin, a maid who had briefly served the Duskbournes in the late 1860s before disappearing from Hollow Creek. Rumor placed her in a village across the river, working under her maiden name to avoid recognition. If she could be found, she might confirm the horrors suspected but unseen. Harrow tracked her down in February in a small cottage near Hudson. At first, Anastasia refused to speak. Her hands trembled as she poured tea, her eyes darting to the windows as though expecting Seraphine herself to appear. Only when Harrow produced Morwenna's notes, the sketches of the locked attic door. The account of the girl in the window did her composure break. Tears welled, and then words, tumbling with the urgency of confession long suppressed. "I served them 6 months," she whispered. 6 months only, but I have never known peace since. What I saw there was not family life, it was liturgy. Every hallway had rules. Every child had rituals. They were not sons and daughters. They were vessels. Anastasia described the suffocating order of the household. Each child had a separate room, forbidden to enter another's. Meals were taken in silence, the children waiting for Seraphine's nod before lifting a spoon. They addressed their guardians only as Sir and Madam. To disobey even slightly meant punishment: hours of kneeling, nights standing in corners, days without food. But worse than the punishments were the rituals. Anastasia recalled being ordered to prepare basins of bitter draughts, concoctions of wormwood, valerian, and some darker tincture whose smell turned her stomach. Seraphine would administer these to the children at night, then draw symbols on their foreheads with what appeared to be ink, though Anastasia suspected it was blood. The children would sway and murmur as Seraphine chanted phrases that twisted Latin into grotesque forms: ex piatis, in vasculo, purgatus erit, from the sinful into the vessel. Purified it shall be. The attic rooms, she confessed, haunted her most. She was ordered to leave trays of food outside the locked doors 3 times daily, but was forbidden to enter. Yet, through the cracks, she heard them children's voices, fragile, desperate, sometimes crying, sometimes singing to themselves in the dark. She glimpsed one once, when a door stood ajar, a boy thin as a reed, eyes wild, hands clawing at the light before Seraphine slammed it shut. When Anastasia dared ask who they were, Seraphine replied coldly, "Not yours to know. They are vessels for the sins of the redeemable." It was the first time Anastasia heard the word that would define the entire horror vessels. She fled Ashwood House after witnessing a punishment that chilled her blood. Young Thaddeus, by then about 16, had spoken out of turn during supper. For that, Seraphine forced him to stand motionless all night in the grand hall. Each hour she returned, lantern in hand, to ensure he had not moved. Anastasia watched his face stiffen into mask-like stillness, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. By dawn, he had collapsed, and Seraphine only murmured, "The sin weakens when the flesh yields." That night, Anastasia packed her belongings and vanished before sunrise. Inspector Harrow recorded every word. Her testimony painted a picture darker than even Silas's research had suggested. This was not merely unlawful adoption or neglect. It was a system of ritualized control. Children molded into pawns of Seraphine's private theology. With Anastasia's account, the Vanes' suspicions crystallized. The hidden children, the ones glimpsed at windows. The ones crying in the attic were not part of the family presented at church. They were the vessels, isolated, malnourished, drained of life. Meanwhile, the publicly acknowledged children, the redeemable, were indoctrinated, their supposed sins purged by transference into those hidden. The implications were horrifying. If Seraphine believed vessels could be filled with sin until they were no longer useful. What became of them afterward, Anastasia had no answer. But she recalled Seraphine once muttering as she looked towards the orchard, "The soil remembers the full ones." For Harrow, this was nearly enough. He urged patience, promising to push for state involvement. But Silas, consumed by urgency, began pressing harder. He mapped the grounds of Ashwood House, noting where earth seemed disturbed, where roses bloomed too red in soil too poor. Morwenna, though fearful, continued her friendship with Seraphine to glean scraps of information, and Isolde, restless and bold, lingered near the estate by night, sketching symbols she saw chalked faintly on stones near the garden's edge. Hollow Creek itself simmered with rumor. Tales of the children of the attic grew into legend. Some said they were ghosts, others that Seraphine bred them as sacrifices. But still, the town acted not at all. The Duskbournes remained untouchable, their wealth a shield, their manners a mask. Only the Vanes, armed now with Anastasia's testimony, recognized the scale of the threat. What they lacked was the final piece undeniable evidence that could shatter the silence of Hollow Creek, and in the year to come, that evidence would be found in the most dreadful of ways. The winter snows of 1871 pressed heavily upon Hollow Creek, muffling the world in white. Yet, within Ashwood House, the darkness endured, untouched by season or weather. For Morwenna Vane, the silence had grown intolerable. Anastasia Corvin's testimony still echoed in her mind: the vessels in the attic, the punishments, the phrase, "the soil remembers the full ones." She could not sleep without seeing thin faces peering from behind locked doors. It was during one of her carefully maintained visits to Seraphine that fate provided the clue she had long awaited. Seraphine excused herself to tend to one of the children, leaving Morwenna alone in the parlor. On the desk lay a leather-bound book, its clasp undone as though abandoned in haste. Morwenna's conscience battled her terror, but curiosity overcame both. She opened the book. Inside, she found not household accounts or prayers, but a journal. The handwriting was Seraphine's sharp, angular strokes, more like carvings than script. What she read chilled her blood. The entries spoke of children not by name but by number. Vessel 3 absorbed corruption from Irispeth, progress noted. Vessel 5 failed to contain sin. Disposal required. The redeemables grow stronger as their burdens are lessened. Each phrase was clinical, stripped of humanity. These were not children to Seraphine. They were containers. One passage in particular struck Morwenna. When vessels reach fullness, they cannot endure. Their flesh weakens, collapses, yet their sin does not vanish, it seeps into soil. Ashwood's orchard thrives upon this offering. Thus the cycle is sanctified. The orchard. The very place Silas had circled on his crude maps, noting how roses and apple trees flourished unnaturally in poor ground. Morwenna copied the passage hastily onto a scrap of paper, returning the journal just as Seraphine re-entered. Her hostess noticed nothing, or perhaps noticed everything and chose to let it pass. That night, Morwenna shared the words with Silas and Isolde. Her husband's face hardened. "Then the orchard is not simply fertile," he muttered. "It is fed." Isolde, her hands trembling, whispered what all three of them feared. "The vessels are buried there." In March, under cover of darkness, Silas and Inspector Harrow stole into the orchard, Snow still patched the ground, but in certain places the earth seemed disturbed, sunken as if it had never settled properly. Beneath the gnarled apple trees, the soil was softer, darker than elsewhere. They dug with bare hands until their fingers bled. After scarcely a foot, Harrow struck wood. It was not a coffin in any formal sense, merely a crude box of pine boards nailed hastily together. Inside lay the remains of a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. The body shriveled by time but still bearing traces of cloth, thin and ragged. Harrow recoiled, swearing under his breath. Silas forced himself to look, noting the faint markings on the child's forehead, symbols drawn in what had once been ink or blood. They covered the grave again, hearts pounding. Harrow urged caution. If we dig further, we risk discovery. But this is proof. Children lie buried here. Silas nodded grimly, yet in his eyes burned not triumph but terror. For if one body lay beneath the orchard, how many more did the soil conceal? Meanwhile, Isolde grew more daring still. She returned to the estate during daylight, sketching the trees and the pattern of depressions in the ground. She counted at least 12 such sites, perhaps more. Each tree, she told her mother, marks a vessel. Seraphine tends them as though they were altars. The Vanes shared their findings with Harrow, who pressed Albany officials for action. Yet bureaucracy moved slowly, and the Duskbournes' influence stretched wide. Alaric donated a substantial sum to the county poor fund that spring, a gesture which silenced many tongues. Still, Harrow persisted, promising warrants were only weeks away. But weeks were dangerous in Hollow Creek. The Duskbournes seemed to sense suspicion tightening around them. Seraphine ceased inviting Morwenna to tea, citing illness. The children no longer attended church, save for Thaddeus, whose gaunt face suggested privations beyond fasting. At night, villagers reported strange lights flickering in the orchard, as though lanterns moved among the trees. And once, a farmer claimed he heard singing children's voices rising in eerie unison before being cut off all at once. Morwenna feared their time was running short. She urged Silas to take Isolde and leave Hollow Creek until the authorities arrived. But Silas refused. If we leave, we abandon the truth. And those children, those still alive in the attic who will speak for them, his resolve, though noble, would prove perilous. The final clue came not from the orchard, but from Seraphine's own hand. Another entry, copied by Morwenna during her last visit, read, "The 12th vessel nears fullness. When the equinox comes, it shall be offered, and the redeemables will be free of their final stain. Thus the family will stand perfected." The spring equinox was only days away. Whatever ritual the Duskbournes intended, it would not merely mean another burial, it would mark the culmination of decades of secret liturgy. The Vanes and Inspector Harrow resolved that they could wait no longer. Proof lay not only in the orchard but within the house itself, behind the locked attic doors. To save the living and honor the dead, they would have to cross the threshold of Ashwood House, knowing well that few who entered its halls ever returned unchanged. The night of the spring equinox, 1871, descended upon Hollow Creek with a peculiar stillness. Clouds smothered the moon, and the air carried a weight like the hush before a storm. Villagers whispered of strange omens, livestock restless, dogs howling at shadows, and an orange glow flickering at the crest of the hill where Ashwood House loomed. Inside the Vane home, Silas spread his crude map across the table one last time. His hand trembled as he pointed to the attic wing. That is where the vessels are kept. Tonight, Seraphine means to offer the 12th. If we wait for Albany's warrants, it will be too late. Morwenna said nothing, her jaw set with a grim resolve. She had begged Silas to stay, to protect Isolde, but her pleas had gone unanswered. Their daughter, pale but resolute, insisted on joining. "I have seen the children in the windows," she whispered. If they are left alone tonight, they will die. Inspector Harrow, armed with a pistol and lantern, gave the final word. We go together. We enter, we find proof, and if possible, we bring the living out. The ascent to Ashwood House was made in silence, the great silhouette of the mansion looming larger with each step. From within came the faint pulse of chanting, low and rhythmic, punctuated by the thin cries of children. The sound raised gooseflesh on their arms. Harrow exchanged a glance with Silas, then forced the heavy doors open. The entrance hall was dim, lit only by scattered candles. The portraits of stern ancestors glared from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow the intruders, and from the depths of the house, the chant rose louder. Seraphine's voice, sharp as a blade, weaving through the trembling tones of the children. They climbed the staircase, their footsteps swallowed by the drone of ritual. At the far end of the hall stood the locked attic door. Harrow drew a crowbar, forcing it against the rusted latch. The wood groaned, then split. The door swung open to a wave of stench mildew, sweat, and the unmistakable tang of decay. Inside, the attic was no mere storage space but a chamber of confinement. Rows of narrow pallets lined the walls, each bearing a child. Some were alive, their faces hollow, eyes wide with terror. Others lay still, their small forms twisted in unnatural repose. Symbols were daubed on the floor in dark stains, circles intersecting like a blasphemous geometry. And at the chamber's center stood Seraphine Duskbourne. She was robed in black, her pale face stark in the candlelight. One hand gripped a thin boy no more than 7, while the other traced a knife along his brow. Around her, the redeemable children knelt, chanting phrases drilled into them like scripture. Alaric Duskbourne lingered nearby, his face unreadable, as though detached from the horror. "Stop!" Harrow's voice rang out, his pistol raised. The chanting faltered. Seraphine turned slowly, her eyes shining with a feverish conviction. "You do not understand," she said, her tone calm, almost tender. "Sin is a sickness. These vessels take it upon themselves so the others may walk untainted. Do you not see we are purifying the world, one child at a time?" Silas stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage. "You steal children. You starve them. You bury them like animals. This is no purification. It is murder." Seraphine's smile did not waver. "Murder? No. Transformation. The vessels are chosen. They carry what others cannot bear, and when they are full, the earth takes them, feeding the orchard. The cycle continues." At her signal, the redeemable children rose, their expressions blank, moving as though puppets on strings. Harrow fired a warning shot into the air, the report shattering the silence. The children froze, trembling. Seraphine hissed, tightening her grip on the boy. Morwenna rushed forward, seizing the child from her grasp. For a moment, the spell broke. The boy collapsed into Morwenna's arms, sobbing. Enraged, Seraphine lunged, her knife slashing wildly. Harrow grappled with Alaric, the two men crashing against the walls as candles toppled, spilling wax and flame. Isolde darted among the redeemables, whispering hurried words. "You are not vessels. You are children." Run confused. Some hesitated, breaking from their formation. Others clutched their heads, as though awakening from a long sleep. The struggle turned chaotic. Harrow's pistol discharged again, striking the rafters. Smoke thickened as fire licked at the dry timbers. Silas pinned Alaric to the floor, shouting for Morwenna and Isolde to flee with the children. But Seraphine did not flee. Standing amid the spreading fire, she raised her arms high, her voice ringing above the roar. "If the vessels burn, their sin shall rise like incense. The orchard will bloom eternal." Her words were drowned as a beam cracked and fell, crushing her where she stood. Alaric, pinned beneath Silas, gave a final rasping laugh before the flames consumed him. Harrow, coughing from smoke, dragged Silas to his feet. Together they herded the surviving children through the choking halls, Morwenna leading the way with the boy she had rescued still clinging to her. They burst into the night just as the roof gave way, the mansion collapsing in a thunder of embers. From the hilltop, villagers watched in awe and terror as Ashwood House burned, its windows glowing like eyes of some dying beast. The cries of children mingled with the roar of the fire, a sound that would haunt Hollow Creek for generations. By dawn, nothing remained but blackened stone and smoking ash. Of the Duskbournes, no trace survived save whispers, and the orchard strangely untouched, its blossoms pale against the ruin. Inspector Harrow filed his report, citing child abduction, unlawful confinement, and ritual abuse. Yet many details the chanting, the symbols, Seraphine's final words were omitted, consigned to silence. No court will hear of vessels, he told Silas grimly. Better they believe this was madness than risk them thinking it was faith. The rescued children were sent to asylums and foster homes. Some recovered, though haunted, others never spoke again. As for Hollow Creek, it lived under a shadow. The orchard grew unnaturally lush that spring, its fruit larger, its blossoms too white. Few dared eat from it. Most avoided the hill altogether, muttering that the soil remembered more than it should. For the Vanes, survival was both victory and curse. Morwenna kept her notes but locked them away, unable to read without trembling. Silas grew withdrawn, convinced the fire had not ended the Duskbournes' work. And Isolde, older now, bore scars of knowledge beyond her years. She often woke in the night whispering the words Salora had once told her, "We do not play. We prepare." And so the tale of the Duskbournes ended not with closure but with smoke, ash, and unanswered questions. Whether their creed perished in the flames or lived on in whispers elsewhere, no one could say. But the orchard still stood, and each spring its blossoms shone too brightly like pale faces pressed against attic windows, waiting to be seen.